This video is brought to you by Squarespace. Build your online presence and run your business with Squarespace. What is up, Solo Cups? My name is John Solo, and you probably know me as the guy who either ruins or enriches childhoods by unpacking the messed up origins of your favorite myths and fairy tales. I've been doing this for almost 4 years now, and in that time I've covered literally over 100 stories, some of which have been truly disturbing, while others weren't nearly as traumatizing as I expected. With that in mind, last year I went through the entirety of my folklore series and ranked every single story we've covered by how messed up it was. And today I want to relive all the PTSD the show has given me by doing the exact same thing with my Disney series. Which means we're going to be revisiting some of the very same fairy tales that laid the foundation for this series, many of which we actually haven't talked about since I covered them years ago. And let me tell ya, even I forgot how twisted some of these stories are and just how much Disney had to tone down and cover up certain elements. So I think those of you who've been around for a long time are really going to appreciate this review. Either that, or you'll hate me for reminding you about the details you managed to block out. Regardless of the outcome, I could not be more excited to get into this with you guys, but first I've got to say thanks to our friends at Squarespace for sponsoring this episode. You know, doing this tier list was a lot of fun because I got to look back at the past several years worth of content, and it's honestly kind of crazy how long Squarespace has been supporting the show. For the past 2 years, I've been using them to maintain messeduporigins.com, and in that time, thousands of SoloFam members have built websites of their own to support their passion projects. And it's not hard to see why, because Squarespace makes the process so damn easy. From their seemingly endless library of stunning pre-made templates to their super intuitive interface that lets you customize your site however you want. You can buy your own domain, create galleries and playlists for your art and music. I personally was able to make a full list of my favorite resources for researching messed up origins, and even included Amazon affiliate links so those interested can buy them and support the channel simultaneously. On top of all that, they also give creators access to useful marketing tools and analytics so you can gauge how much traffic your website is generating as well as where it's coming from. And they have an incredible customer support team that's available 24/7, so even you night owls won't be stranded. To those of you who've been sitting on your dream for a little too long, now's your chance to take action. Just go to squarespace.com/JohnSolo to sign up for your completely free trial. Then when you're ready to reveal your passion project to the world, use code JohnSolo to get 10% off your first purchase. You guys like my fancy setup? You almost can't even tell that it's just a tray sitting on top of a printer box. 1 million subscribers and this is my setup. If I didn't do it though, the laptop wouldn't be in frame over here, so I have no regrets. Alright, so I think the best way for me to go about doing this would be to start with the very first story I ever covered and the first one to go viral, The Little Mermaid. There is a lot to unpack with this one because in the movie, Ariel just wants to live among the humans because she's fascinated by their world. But in the book, it's because mermaids don't have souls and she wants to have an afterlife of some kind. Wait. Do you think mermaids not having souls is why Disney made Ariel a redhead? What may be the most gruesome part of the original story is the side effects of the potion the mermaid drinks to become human. She can't walk without feeling like she's being stabbed, she can't talk because the witch cut out her tongue, and the ending is straight up depressing. The little mermaid dies and then is sent to purgatory where she has to just hang out for the next 300 years. Combine all that with the fact that the story was written as a love letter to a male companion of Hans Christian Andersen's who did not feel the same way, and I've got to slide this in the S tier. Starting strong this episode. Next on the docket is Cinderella, which actually has some of my favorite origin stories. In the Italian version, Zizola is tricked into breaking her mom's neck, and in the Chinese variant, Ye Shen's stepmom kills and eats her fairy godfish. So factoring all that in with the copious amounts of child abuse the story is infamous for, and I've got to go with the A tier. My heart is kind of saying S tier, but I just know what the upcoming stories have in store, so I've got to follow my brain on this one. Like Snow White, for instance. This is a really fucked up one. Right out of the gate, you've got the evil stepmom ordering Snow White's execution so she can eat her lungs and liver. There's 3 additional counts of attempted murder after that, a prince who's gotta be a necrophiliac, and that's just in the Grimm brothers version. In the one by Giambattista Basile, Snow White is woken up from her sleeping spell accidentally and then beaten until she's unrecognizable and turned into a slave by her uncle's wife. It does have a happy ending, but that only counts for so much when the rest of the story is depressing as all hell, so I'm putting this one right into the S tier. And now, Sleeping Beauty. This is actually one that I've got to revisit because there's a ton of different versions and I've only talked about like one of them. Still though, that one is pretty messed up. The princess character is raped by a king in her sleep, she wakes up to find herself breastfeeding 2 babies, and the evil queen tries to kill and eat those babies. Yeah, for some reason, evil queens had a thing for eating human flesh. Maybe it was really good. I don't know. This is another one where reflexively I want to put it in the A tier, but if I'm being honest, the origins of Rapunzel have these same vibes, but worse because she doesn't actually sleep through all the terrible stuff that happens to her. Which, by the way, includes her being struck blind by her psychopathic witch guardian, left in the desert to die, and having to give birth completely on her own without ever receiving the birds and the bees talk. Actually, now that I think about it, since she didn't know what pregnancy was and she was blind, do you think that Rapunzel thought that she just pooped out a baby? You know what? Don't answer that. My point is that Sleeping Beauty isn't as dark as Rapunzel, so we're going B tier and A tier respectively. The next classic on the list is Beauty and the Beast, which honestly is not all that messed up even compared to the Disney version. I mean, the Beast does get friend-zoned by Beauty, so that really sucks, and she does have evil, ugly, manipulative stepsisters, but that's about it. Still though, the concept of a girl being held prisoner by a monster until she develops Stockholm Syndrome and marries him is pretty dark for a kid's story, so I'm giving it a point and putting it in the E tier. Alright, what's next? Mulan. This is an intense one. You've got an antagonist based on a real barbarian, a war that was inspired by a real culture conflict that led to the deaths of thousands of innocent people. Mulan's dad dies before she returns, and she ends up being sold into sex slavery after the war, and she kills herself to get out of it. Yeah, I'm gonna be bold and say it's S tier worthy. I know, this video is full of hot takes so far. Alright, next is Princess and the Frog. That's another one I've got to revisit this year, because the Brothers Grimm version I originally covered isn't that dark. It's definitely weird, like the fact that the princess is old enough to get married, yet young enough to still be entertained by playing with a bouncy ball. I also find it hilarious that instead of true love's kiss being what breaks the spell, it's the princess throwing the frog at the wall. But we're not ranking these stories by how weird and hilarious they are, so F tier. Honestly, that's one I may go back and change when I revisit the story, but we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Okay, just to warn you, this next one is real heavy. Winnie the Pooh. And I wish I was kidding. If you're a Star Wars fan, you could basically think of Christopher Robin as Jake Lloyd, who was bullied relentlessly throughout his childhood for playing Anakin in Episode 1. Christopher Robin was teased by both family and friends about his famous relationship with his stuffed animals, had his childhood exploited for boatloads of cash, and his chance to develop his own identity ripped away from him. Granted, that definitely wasn't his father's intention, but it was the end result. And if you put yourself in Christopher Robin's shoes, I think you'd agree that painful experience is worthy of a B tier. I would say A tier, but the source material itself has to be factored in, and those books are far from messed up, so it lost a point for that. And now we have Aladdin. This one is all over the place with the weirdness. The genie is an ugly bastard. Aladdin peeks in on the princess when she's at the bathhouse, then uses the genie to transport her into his bedroom in the middle of the night so he can sleep next to her. Oh, and at the beginning of the story, Aladdin is such a loser that his dad dies of disappointment. Couldn't forget that detail. All that being said though, I don't think the messed up parts of this story are quite as bad as the others, so baby's going in the B tier. Now Tarzan. Disney actually did a really good job appropriating this one for kids because the original book by Edgar Rice Burroughs was violent and sad, like a novelization of the Nature is Metal Instagram page. And the two characters most responsible for that violence are Kerchak, who kills Tarzan's dad in the book, and Tarzan himself, who kills Sabor, as well as some local natives who killed his mother, Kala. Also, Jane, the love interest from the Disney movie, is kidnapped by an ape that plans to use her for making babies with. Just imagine being in her shoes for that experience. Initially, I was going to say A tier, but you have to consider this book isn't even for kids, and it's about a man raised in a jungle, so those darker elements kind of have to be there if the goal is authenticity. With that in mind, I'm also saying B tier for Tarzan. Next is Peter Pan. I could go on for 13 minutes and 36 seconds about this one. Peter Pan is a kidnapper, a murderer, he starves and tortures children without the slightest bit of empathy, and the author was kind of a creep. Without a doubt, this one belongs in the S tier. If you want me to elaborate on why, just watch the video. Pocahontas. S tier. Another one that should be obvious to most people, unless you're a colonial settler. Then you might need it explained. Hunchback of Notre Dame is another pretty intense one. For starters, it goes into more detail about his disabilities, like how he's blind and deaf, his abuse at the hands of Cloud Frollo, and his tragically unreciprocated love for Esmeralda. Also, the ending, spoiler alert, involves Quasimodo's skeleton being discovered all curled up next to Esmeralda's skeleton years after Frollo executes her. Homie just couldn't take a hint. Unfortunately, there's a ton of smaller details that I just don't have time to get into, so you're just gonna have to trust me when I say that this one is an A tier. Honestly, it would have been higher, but even the Disney version is dark as hell, so if I'm using that as a point of reference, A tier it is. Ooh, another favorite of mine is next. Hercules. If you know anything about Greek mythology, you already know this will be a high-scoring one. I mean, if you look at any individual character from this movie, their real backstory involves copious amounts of misery. Heracles, manipulated into killing his wife and children, spends years repenting for his sins, and goes on to be poisoned by his jealous wife. Meg has her head smashed in by Heracles. Chiron, the original Phil, is shot by one of Heracles' arrows that's been dipped in poisonous Hydra blood after the hero gets plastered and mistakes him for an enemy. And don't even get me started on Zeus and Hera. Just imagine the characters from the movie acting those myths out in some deranged sequel. Don't get me wrong, I would definitely go see it, but it would be deranged. Without an ounce of hesitation or reservation, I'm putting Heracles in the S tier. Pinocchio is next. Did you know that asshole kills Jiminy Cricket in the original story? Yeah, I almost don't feel bad for him when those vagabonds string him up in that tree, which was the story's original ending, by the way. The author only added on to it because of demand from his readers. But even the additional chapters just added more misery to his life. He's turned into a donkey and made a circus attraction, then has to watch one of his only friends, who also turned into a donkey, die. Even that's just the tip of the iceberg, so I'm saying this is a very strong S tier. Oof, I was dreading this one. Fox and the Hound, the very first episode to have very in the title, so you know it's a good one. I don't want to spoil too much because I feel like you newer viewers still haven't seen it yet, but instead of being an adorable story about a friendship between a fox and a hound, it's about a psychopathic hunter pursuing revenge on a fox using any means necessary. To be honest, I still can't watch this episode or even the Disney movie without feeling like someone kicked my soul in the balls, so I'm saying S tier. Alright, we're getting a little top heavy here. I think it's time to balance it out. And while we're on the theme of nature, let's talk about Bambi. This one is kind of like Tarzan, where it's dark, but loses some points because it's not a kid's story and takes place in nature, which is in fact metal. There are some pretty sad moments throughout though, like when Bambi's mom dies or when his cousin Gobo walks directly up to the hunter who used to be his owner and gets shot because the hunter doesn't recognize him. All good stories have a little bit of tragedy though, and this one at least has a happy ending. So I think D tier is a good spot for it. Next on the list is Dumbo, sweet baby Dumbo. You know, this one's origins actually aren't that sad. They're at least no sadder than the movie itself, which I'm not ashamed to admit makes me cry like a bitch every time I watch it because look at it. How could you not? Unfortunately for Dumbo though, we're ranking these by how messed up the origin story is, and the honest truth is that it's really just not messed up. So as much as it pains me to do it, I've got to put Dumbo in the F tier.
Poor little guy. There he goes, without a friend in the world.
Alright, Timothy Mouse, you don't have to rub it in. Now our subject is the Pied Piper, which admittedly would fit better in the folklore series, but I hadn't started that back when I made this episode. Honestly though, its origins are pretty messy, so I kind of wish I wasn't ranking it at all. The problem is there's just a lot of theory behind it. The Pied Piper may have been a real person, and he may have led a massive group of children to their deaths by way of drowning or landslide, but we'll just never know. There's also a chance there was no Piper at all, and that the children being kidnapped was really code for the youngest members of every family abandoning Hamelin because of its crappy inheritance laws. Since the Pied Piper's origins are shrouded in mystery, I feel like I have to put him somewhere in the middle, so D tier. Next up is another story about a man raised by animals, Jungle Book, and it's a really good story, might I add. I almost wish my episode on it didn't perform so well so I could cover it again. Unfortunately, I just did too perfect of a job, so maybe someday, but not anytime soon. Anyway, I'd say this is a pretty middle-of-the-road story. There's elements of it that are pretty brutal, like how one of Mowgli's brothers snaps a jackal's spine after interrogating him, and Shere Khan has a reputation for killing and eating children. But to me, it's not much more messed up than the movie, which alludes to a lot of brutality without actually showing it, so I'm going D tier on this one. Oh hell yeah, our next candidate is, without a doubt, one of my favorite episodes of the entire Messed Up Origin series, The Three Little Pigs. This one was just a lot of fun. Not only did I get to dissect one of my favorite cartoons from childhood, but it also marked the birth of Dave. The original story is actually very similar to the cartoon, but just with a dash more murder. For example, the first 2 pigs are killed and eaten within just minutes of building their houses, and Dave the oldest gets his revenge by boiling the wolf alive and eating him for dinner, which I would say is pretty morbid. To make it worse though, I've gotten a lot of comments pointing out that Dave technically ate his brothers by eating the wolf. But I'm not going to factor that into my analysis because a few days had passed before then and the wolf probably shit them out before he was eaten. So with that being said, I would say Three Little Pigs is a C tier. Almost a B tier, but falls just a little bit short. Alright, next up is The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, which I can only describe as a story about a bunch of flawed, scheming douchebags. The only remotely good person in this whole story is the main character, Ichabod Crane, who's a school teacher that genuinely cares about his students. But even still, he's a manipulative leech. The entire story is about he and Brom Bones' pursuit of this girl Katrina, who's hot with a rich father, and it ends with Ichabod taking a pumpkin to the face courtesy of Brom Bones and disappearing from town after that. The weird thing is that Disney was actually pretty loyal to the source material with their retelling, and the stories that were thought to have inspired the Headless Horseman actually feature a ghost who's nice and helpful to the people he encounters. And so on the messed up scale, I have no choice but to put this one towards the bottom, in the E tier. Another legendary story shows up on the docket, Alice in Wonderland. Can you believe it's been almost 3 years since I covered this one and I still haven't done the sequel yet? Well, this is a pretty tricky one to rank because a lot of it depends on how much weight you want to put on Lewis Carroll's weird relationship with Alice Little and the dozens of other little girls he was friends with. Is it creepy by today's standards? Definitely. But back in the Victorian era, who wasn't friends with a 6-year-old girl? Real world weirdness aside, I do think Alice's story does have some dark elements, like her almost getting her limbs cut off while trapped in the rabbit's house and the Duchess who violently shakes her upset baby. But as a whole, the story isn't messed up, it's just really weird. Honestly, the darkest thing about it is probably that the Mad Hatter has mercury poisoning. I feel like I'm gonna get some flack from the Alice enthusiasts out there, but I'm putting a girl and her adventure down the rabbit hole in the C tier. Now, if you really want a messed up story, then I'd say check out the one that inspired Frozen, The Snow Queen by Hans Christian Andersen. Firstly, a little boy is kidnapped by a heartless queen and stuck playing with frozen blocks all day while she brainwashes him with her magic. Then you've got his best friend, the little girl Gerda, who risks life and limb to save him. She's held prisoner by a witch for months on end, witnesses all of her caravan guards get murdered by bandits, and one of those bandits tries to chop her up and eat her. Admittedly, Andersen doesn't go into much detail with the violence, but as an adult, you can imagine how bloody a scene like that would look and how terrifying a journey like that would be for a little girl. That is why I'm putting Snow Queen in the A tier. Bet you didn't see that one coming. You can probably predict this next one though, because we're talking about Anastasia, which, spoiler alert, is right up there with our most messed up origins of all time. From the way that the Romanovs and Russian government treated their citizens leading up to and through World War I, to the family's manipulation by Rasputin, who exploited their sick child to gain their trust. Then there's the Romanovs' execution, of course, which they didn't know was going to happen until about 5 seconds beforehand and didn't even kill all of them on the first go. Because many of them had sewn diamonds into their clothes in case they needed to fund an escape, the bullets didn't pierce them, and some of the daughters were left gasping for air and losing blood until the soldiers went through the bodies and stabbed them with bayonets. And all of that is just scratching the surface of this story, so with the confidence of 1,000 Adonises, I'm gonna put Anastasia in the S tier. After Anastasia, we have another legendary story with an origin that isn't quite as messed up as some of the others, Lion King. As many of you know, Lion King was somewhat inspired by Shakespeare's Hamlet, which, like most of Shakespeare's plays, is fucking terrible despite no one wanting to admit that. And while it does end with the murder/suicide of pretty much all of the play's major characters, I don't consider their deaths messed up because they were all shitty people and deserve it for being Shakespeare characters. What is pretty sinister though is that there's a lot of evidence that Lion King was actually ripped off a Japanese cartoon, Kimba the White Lion, whose story was pretty similar to Simba's. Factoring all this in, I feel like Lion King belongs in the C tier. Next is Aladdin and the King of Thieves, based on Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves, another one of the most iconic stories from the 1001 Arabian Nights collection that ironically wasn't part of the collection originally. I still remember being surprised at how gruesome this story is. The main character's brother gets brutally stabbed to death and dismembered by bandits, and so Ali Baba has to pay for his corpse to be sewn back together. Now, Not gonna lie, I do think the brother deserved it because he tried extorting Alibaba, but it's the way he went out that does it for me. And speaking of violent deaths, at the end of the story, Alibaba's slave girl dumps hot oil on the heads of the 40 thieves who were planning on killing them. The girl commits almost 4 dozen murders within about 5 minutes of each other, then goes on to stab the thieves' captain to death. I'll admit, it's a little more badass than messed up, but just because of the brutal nature of their deaths, I've got to put this one in the A tier. And now we're back to The Lion King. Lion King 2, that is. You can probably guess how I feel about this one, because similar to how the first movie was inspired by Hamlet, the second is based on Romeo and Juliet, which has to be one of the worst stories ever written. Not only are there teenagers killing each other in the streets because of a made-up feud between the two most pretentious families in Italy, but the only two mentor characters, Friar Lawrence and Juliet's nurse, directly contribute to the death of the couple and don't face any repercussions for it. Listen, I'm sure I'm gonna get some comments saying those details were intentional and the play is a drama, like that automatically absolves it of being straight up garbage, but I'm not letting Billy get off that easy. It's a bad story. And as much as I'd love to put it in the F tier for that alone, I've got to stay unbiased in my judgment. So considering that the plot points I mentioned are in fact messed up, the origins of Lion King 2 are worthy of the C tier. And now we move on to Thumbelina, based on another Hans Christian Andersen story that makes you wish that you could dive into its pages and help the protagonist. The original story, Tamalisa, is actually captured pretty accurately in the movie. This girl is constantly being kidnapped, almost forced into arranged marriages, and threatened with violence by everyone around her. It does have a happy ending, but if you put yourself in Tamalisa's tiny shoes and imagine that you're a 3-inch tall female that for some reason beetles, moles, and frogs are all attracted to, the world becomes a pretty scary place. It's also worth mentioning that Tamalisa's mom wakes up to find her missing and does not get reunited with her by the end of the story, so for all she knows, her little fairy daughter was either eaten by a raccoon or caught in a lawnmower. All that being said, there's a lot more messed up threats in this one than there is action, and since actions speak louder than words, I'm putting Thumbelina in the dead center with the C tier. Next up are the origins for Maui, Moana, Te Fiti, and Te Ka, which for my sanity's sake, I'm gonna combine into one item. For those who haven't seen these episodes, you are really missing out on some messed up Polynesian mythology. I, of course, don't have time to go through all the details, but here are some highlights. In the original myth, Maui dies after turning himself into a worm and crawling into the goddess of death's vagina. Told ya. Also, Pele, or Te Ka, bangs her sister's husband, which ultimately leads to her literally being torn apart by said sister. And the icing on the cake is that Maui actually kills the water goddess that inspired Moana by dragging her onto the beach where she slowly and painfully suffocates. I'll be honest, I have no idea why I didn't put very in any of these videos' titles, but I regret it because there is no doubt in my mind that these origin stories belong in the S tier. Okay, we finally arrived at the most cancelable episode I've ever done, Song of the South, the movie that Disney shouldn't have made the most. Besides the sequel trilogy, of course. I could go on and on about what makes this one so controversial, but to put it simply, the portrayal of African Americans as happy-go-lucky slaves was not received well. To make matters worse, the folk tales about Brer Rabbit and friends that were interspersed throughout the film all came from actual slaves. And the guy who collected them, Joel Chandler Harris, made some serious profit off these tales without giving any back to the people he took them from, and while still remaining a supporter of slavery. Like I said in my video about Song of the South, I genuinely disagree with most claims of cultural appropriation. In my experience, those complaints come from pudgy white people trying to prove they're one of the good ones by being offended on behalf of a culture that genuinely doesn't give a shit. But in this case, I totally agree with the appropriation claims. The only reason I want Splash Mountain to stick with its current theme is that it's the only genuine representation of African American folklore in any of Disney's parks, and I don't think that should be so carelessly cast aside in favor of some short-sighted social justice goal. Anyway, you knew the ranking before I even started this spiel. Song of the South goes in the S tier, no question. And last, but certainly not least, we have the most recent episode of Disney Explained, which was genuinely one of my favorites to work on, despite being the most stress-inducing, 101 Dalmatians. I'll be honest, while reading the original book by Dodie Smith, I was genuinely taken aback by the cruelty of Cruella de Vil. She drowns her own cat's kittens without reservation, is just as happy to murder puppies just to make a coat out of them, and maybe worst of all, when she invites her guests to dinner, she lathers all of their food in so much pepper that it's basically inedible. Speaking of puppies, look who came to visit. Thank you. You up from your nap? I'm happy to say that she and her cronies definitely got what was coming to them by the end of the story, but that doesn't make it any less dark. If this crazy bitch had succeeded in her plot, can you stop licking me for 5 seconds? If she succeeded in her plot, I would definitely be putting this one in the S tier, but since she failed miserably and everyone got home safely, I feel like the C tier is the way to go. And that, Solo Fam, was the official rankings for the Disney edition of Messed Up Origins. Holy shit, did it take longer than I expected. That being said, if you want to make a tier list of your own and send it to me, I would highly encourage you to do so. I've got all the assets available for download on messeduporigins.com, and I'm genuinely curious to see how many of you disagree with me. But Solo Fam, if you enjoyed this video and want to show your support for the channel, I would greatly appreciate it if you hit those like and subscribe buttons. Like I said, this took forever to film, and it still needs to be edited, so I could use all the support I can get. To anyone who wants to stay updated on Messed Up Origins news and be treated to little bits of messed up trivia now and again, you should follow me on social media. And then of course, follow Penny on social media, because if we were doing a cuteness tier list, she would be in the S tier. I'll see you all again early next week with another episode of Astrology Explained, where I dive into the dark and mysterious mythology of Leo. Until then, my name is John Solo, and remember, John shot first.